Big shout out to all the truckers that listen to our show. From our compound, from the West Coast to the East Coast to worldwide, both on the internet and terrestrial radio, you're listening to Gary Anderson on Night Dreams Talk Radio After Dark.
And we are back with Tom Whitmore. Hey, Tom, we are back on the air.
Hi, Gary. Thank you for having me on.
Well,
glad to be here.
It's always exciting to have you on because you're very knowledgeable. What is your feeling about this whole thing about Eisenhower, the documents that were, like aliens supposedly, taking humans, as food and all? I mean, there's so much of these rumors it's going around out there. I want to put it to bed if we can. I do know that I think something is going on. People are disappearing right and left worldwide with no trace. People are claiming, like Terry Lovelace, Timothy Collin, Calvin Parker, and a whole bunch of other people claim they've been abducted. And I'll tell you what, there's stories that are not the friendly aliens. It's a horror story. So, I mean, I just want to try to clear up as much as we can because, you get to read all these documents. You get to, be it if that some of them are real, some are fake, but it must give you a general idea of what is going on out here.
Well, something's going on, and there are way too many people reporting abduction experiences to just ignore it. I wish I could give definitive answers to this. I'm a citizen like everyone else, and I don't have access to any inside information, assuming that the government has any. But we can tell, Gary, from the activity and the reports that we get from the population that something's going on. And like I said, some of the contacts are positive, some of the contacts are neutral, and some of the contacts are negative. Now, whether there's any kind of treaty between the government and one or more alien groups in exchange for technology, I just cannot say. That's on the rumor level. And like I said, those rumors got started in the 1980s. They really came into the public domain then. And it's become folklore and legend for the UFO community since then. And for some people, it's become an article of faith that there is some kind of an agreement going on. But we do know for sure that we've received many, many, many stories and reports of people being abducted, and there are simply far too many to simply ignore them.
Well, how about these documents when you're going through them? What are these documents are covering? What topics are they covering?
They cover alleged reports of the crash retrieval analysis. There is one document that is called the White Hot Report that is allegedly a report from General Twining. And General Twining was running Wright-Patterson Air Force Base at one point in time, and then he became the Air Force Vice Chief of Staff under General Vandenberg, and then he later became the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. But in this report, information is provided about information about the craft and particularly about the power plant. Now, if any of this is true and if any of the content has any validity, at that time in the late 40s and the early 50s, those of us who are old enough to remember can remember how focused American science and the American public and even the government and the military was on nuclear power. And we had just developed the atomic bomb, and there was a lot of speculation and expectation that atomic power would be really playing a very prevalent role in our energy needs in the future. So when they started analyzing the power plant, and according to the content of this document, assuming that any of it is true, that they were analyzing in terms of nuclear power, and they believe that some kind of heavy water may have been involved, and they were looking at it in nuclear terms. Now, there may have been some element or dynamic of nuclear energy in the power plant, in the craft that they recovered, but their technology is obviously way, way, way ahead of ours. And I think there's probably much more to that. So now today, when we hear the stories and the rumors and the claims of people that claim to know something about what might be going on in some of these back engineering programs, we basically hear two legends. One side of it is that they've tried to figure out what's going on with that, and they haven't gotten anywhere, and they've basically given up. The other side of it is, yes, they have learned how to use some of it, and we have these craft flying around, okay? And there are those two aspects. But going back to the documents themselves, that these are some of the descriptions we hear of the power plant and the qualities of the craft.
Interesting. You know, I've talked to like Bruce Maccabee. I have had him on the show numerous times. In fact, he's going to be coming back on in April again. I've talked to other, scientists and all this stuff about, back engineering. My father was an electronic engineer. He helped develop a lot of the electronics when Boeing was going to build the super transport back years ago. And it never got, built, never got the funding it needed. But I can tell you, talking to my father, he said that technology-wise, talking to these scientists, I asked them the same thing. If you went back with a cell phone to 1930 or 1940, could they back engineer it? And I hear things impossible because they couldn't do it. Now, if we have an alien humanoid race, it crashes a UFO on this planet, and we go and retrieve the unit and try to back engineer it. I think our technology would be the same way back in the 30s and 40s if you handed them a cell phone and said, hey, I want you to back engineer it. That's the part I have listened, to a couple people. I'm not going to say the one individual. It claims that we have back engineered these UFOs and all this stuff. I just don't think back in the 70s and 80s and the 90s, we would have the technology to actually do it. Now, I could be totally wrong, but I just don't feel that is possible with our level of intelligence. We're not even a level 1 species yet.
Well, I compare it to, I'd take it even further back, and if we could give Leonardo da Vinci an iPhone, how difficult would it be for him, who was one of the most intelligent people of his time, to even begin to understand how it worked, and that kind of a gap in the technology when back then they didn't even have electricity, they didn't have steel, they didn't have the sources of energy that we have now. They didn't have electricity and electronics, so there's such a huge gap in the technology. It would have been impossible for him to get any kind of idea at all how to make something like that. And there is that side of it now. Again, according to rumor, and this is just rumor, but if we did recover craft, there are these rumors that we have had some help in understanding it. But you also have the quality of communication or the problem of communication, because if any of these stories are true about these alleged aliens, the actual communication takes place on a telepathic level. So it may be very difficult, even though we might have one or more of these alleged aliens helping us, it may still be difficult for them to help us advance and learn how to at least use the technology, much less make it. But, we've heard these rumors about Area 51, and they've figured out how to get some of these craft to fly. Now, I think one of the most interesting stories I've heard is about the Cash Landrum incident. And for any of the listeners that aren't familiar with it, this is an incident where several civilians in Texas were confronted with a craft coming overhead that was irradiating them. It was a craft that was in trouble, and there were a number of helicopters that were in the vicinity as well. Well, Richard Doty has told the story, and he's told this on interviews publicly, that craft had been developed at Area 51. They couldn't figure out how to use the alien power plant, and apparently we designed some kind of nuclear-powered power plant for the craft, and that it had flown well at the Area 51 tests, and it was being transferred to a base in Texas, to an Air Force base in Texas, and that it got into trouble. So there's an example of maybe kind of a mixed bag of where we possibly had an alien craft, but we had to substitute our own power plant, and then that had problems. Now, the Cash Landrum incident actually occurred. That's documented, and I'm surprised there's not more insistence by investigators in getting to the bottom of that one, because that's a case that definitely happened.
Well, can you tell us more about it?
Well, the Landrums sued for medical expenses. I believe that the government came back. The judge ruled that the government didn't have to pay them anything, but I believe it's possible that a settlement was reached, in private behind the scenes. But the medical problems that the victims had been documented, and it was written up in a book by John Schusser of MUFON about the Cash Landrum incident. Now, the helicopters were involved in the reports of the Cash Landrum incident from the beginning, and according to Richard Doty, those helicopters were called in because the craft was having trouble, and if it did have to land or if it crashed, that those helicopters were there for immediate recovery.
Interesting. Very interesting. And what way did the people get ill over this, or what happened?
Radiation burns and radiation sickness, the kind of things that happen when you're exposed to excessive radiation. And there was even, an effect on the car. I think it affected, the car was so hot you couldn't touch it. And the craft was close enough, that was really affecting them. It was a long time ago, though. It was back in 1980, I believe, or in the 1980s.
Ah, interesting. Bob Lazar, what do you think about his story?
I just don't know what to think of that, because his story has always been pretty consistent. And I would assume that George Knapp did some careful background checking, and he did some careful checking with his sources. Now, apparently, whatever sources George Knapp has or had, and I don't think he's ever disclosed all of them or any of them, whatever sources he had convinced him that there was enough to Lazar's story that Knapp was willing to go public with it and bring Lazar, out into the public. But it's well established that Lazar's alleged educational credentials just don't check out, and that's been a big sticking point for a lot of people. And there are two sides to that whole controversy. There's one side of people that believe Lazar, and then there's another side that believe that he's just a fraud. And I try not to take too hard of a line on a lot of these things, Gary, because it's such a gray area, and it's all so confusing.
Oh, it is. I remember hearing him on my friend's show, Art Show. He was on several times. His story never changed from the very beginning right to the, to current. It has never wavered. But again, going back and trying to back engineer, that's the part where I get confused, because